In 1956, the British Empire still stretched across the globe, it still had a powerful navy, it still had nuclear weapons, and it still believed, at least on paper, that it was a world power. Yet within weeks, Britain was forced to retreat, humiliated, financially cornered, and permanently demoted on the world stage. No cities were bombed in London. No American troops invaded Britain. No shots were fired between the two allies. Instead, the British Empire was broken by currency, credit, and one phone call from Washington. This is not the story most people learn about the Suez Crisis. They're told it was a military failure, a diplomatic embarrassment, a colonial miscalculation. But that explanation misses the real weapon, because what ended Britain's imperial role was not Egypt, not tanks, not even the Cold War. It was the US dollar, and once you understand how it happened in 1956, you'll start seeing the same pattern repeated again and again right up to the modern world. So the mystery is this: how did the United States bankrupt its closest ally without firing a single shot? And why did that moment quietly change the global financial order forever? To understand the Suez Crisis, you first have to understand a dangerous illusion Britain was living under after World War II. On the surface, Britain emerged victorious from the war. It was on the winning side. It still had colonies. It still had prestige. But underneath, Britain was financially exhausted. By 1945, Britain had sold off most of its overseas assets, accumulated massive wartime debts, lost its position as the world's primary creditor, and quietly become dependent on the United States before the war. Britain had been the financial center of the world. London was the heart of global banking. The British pound was the reserve currency. After the war, that role belonged to America. At Bretton Woods in 1944, a new system was created. The dollar was pegged to gold, other currencies were pegged to the dollar, the US controlled the deepest capital markets, and Washington became the lender of last resort. Britain entered this system from a position of weakness. Its economy relied on imports of oil and food. And this is where the trap was set long before Suez ever happened. Because while Britain still had political power, it no longer had monetary sovereignty. The key figures in this story understood this, but underestimated it. On one side, Anthony Eden, Britain's Prime Minister, an old-school imperialist who believed Britain must act like a great power to remain one. On the other, Dwight D. Eisenhower, US President personally and Colonia, deeply focused on Cold War stability, and fully aware of America's financial leverage, and looming in the background, Gamal Abdel Nasser, President of Egypt, a nationalist leader determined to break free from European control. The fuse was already burning. The Suez Canal was not just a waterway, it was Britain's shortcut to Asia, a lifeline for oil from the Middle East, and a symbol of imperial control. Although the canal ran through Egypt, it was controlled by a company dominated by British and French interests. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the canal. From Egypt's perspective, this was about sovereignty. From Britain's perspective, this was existential. If Britain allowed a former colony to seize such a strategic asset, the message would be clear: the empire was no longer in control. So Britain, along with France and Israel, secretly planned a military operation to retake the canal. Here's the critical mistake: they believed the United States would eventually support them because they were allies. They believed military strength still determined outcomes, and they believed financial consequences could be managed later. But the world had changed. Because Britain could not wage war without dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. Foreign exchange reserves were in dollars. International trade required dollars, and Britain didn't have enough. In October 1956, the plan was executed. Israel invaded Egypt. Britain and France intervened under the pretext of peacekeeping. The Canal Zone was bombed. Militarily, the operation worked. British and French forces achieved their objectives quickly. But something else happened, something far more dangerous. The pound sterling came under attack. Investors around the world began selling pounds. Why? Because war meant capital flight, rising deficits, and fear that Britain would devalue its currency. Britain's foreign exchange reserves began draining at an alarming rate. Every day the war continued. Britain lost more dollars, and here's the twist most history books gloss over: Britain couldn't stop the bleeding without help from the United States. As the crisis escalated, Britain quietly asked the US for financial support. This is where power revealed itself. The Eisenhower administration said no. Not only that, they applied pressure. The US Treasury threatened to block IMF assistance, refused to stabilize the pound, and signaled that Britain was on its own behind closed doors. The message was clear: withdraw, watch your currency collapse. Britain now faced a choice no empire wants to face: continue the war and risk financial ruin, or retreat and accept global humiliation. The pound was hours away from collapse. Britain's gold and dollar reserves were vanishing. Without dollars, Britain couldn't import oil. Without oil, the economy would shut down. Without economic stability, the government would fall. Military victory was meaningless. And so, on November 6, 1956, Britain announced a ceasefire. The invasion stopped, not because of Egypt, not because of the Soviet Union, but because of the dollar. In that moment, the British Empire didn't just lose a canal, it lost its independence. The consequences of Suez were immediate and permanent. Politically, Anthony Eden resigned. Britain's global credibility collapsed. Former colonies accelerated independence movements. Economically, Britain doubled down on austerity. The pound never regained its former status. London's financial dominance shifted to New York. Strategically, Britain accepted a junior role to the US. Independent imperial action was no longer possible. Foreign policy became constrained by financial reality. Suez sent a message the world understood instantly. Power now flowed through finance, not flags, and the dollar sat at the center of that system. Britain tried to adapt. It joined the European project, reduced imperial commitments, rebuilt London as a financial hub. But the core problem remained. Britain no longer controlled the reserve currency, global liquidity, or the rules of international finance, the tools that once sustained empire. Trade dominance, naval power, colonial extraction were obsolete. What mattered now was who issued the currency, who controlled capital flows, and who backstopped crises. Britain never regained that position. No country has except one. If this story feels familiar, it should, because the same mechanism used in 1956 is still in use today. Modern examples include financial sanctions, dollar clearing restrictions, asset freezes, IMF conditionality. Countries that challenge the system often discover the same truth. Britain did. You can have soldiers, resources, public support, but if you don't control the currency system, you are vulnerable. Shocking data tells the story. Over 85% of global trade is invoiced in dollars. Over 60% of global reserves are held in dollars. Most global debt is dollar-denominated. That means financial pressure travels faster than armies. The Suez Crisis wasn't an accident, it was a prototype. Takeaway number 1. Military power without financial power is an illusion. Britain learned that tanks mean nothing if markets turn against you. Takeaway number 2. Currency is the ultimate leverage. The dollar didn't just replace the pound, it replaced empire itself. The Suez Crisis teaches us something uncomfortable. Empires don't always fall with explosions. Sometimes they fall with exchange rates, capital flows, and quiet decisions made in treasury offices. And the most dangerous part, the people living through it often don't realize what's happening until it's already over. So the question isn't whether financial power shapes global politics. The question is, who controls it next and who assumes they still do. If you want more deep, uncensored history about money, power, and the systems that quietly rule the world, subscribe. Because the most important battles are rarely fought on maps. They're fought in balance sheets. And history is still repeating itself.